Tito Okello Lutwa and his 3 days of presidency. Rise and Fall of a Forgotten Soldier. Introduction. In the long and turbulent political history of Uganda, certain names dominate the discourse. Milton Obote, Idi Amin Dada, and Yoweri Museveni. Their legacies are marked by coups, violence, charismatic leadership, and prolonged tenures in power. But nestled in the pages of Uganda's history is the short-lived and often overlooked presidency of General Tito Okello Lutwa, a man whose time at the helm of the nation lasted mere months, sometimes referred to as only 3 symbolic days of authority. His rise and fall were not only reflections of his personal trajectory, but also a mirror of Uganda's instability in the late 20th century. Born in the year 1919, Tito Okello belonged to the Acholi ethnic group of northern Uganda. His story, unlike those of his more flamboyant predecessors and successors, was not one of personal ambition to dominate political space, but rather a soldier's journey caught in the whirlwind of Uganda's tumultuous politics. His life exemplified how military institutions in post-independence Africa often became the stage for political change, and how fragile alliances could determine the fate of entire nations. To truly understand Tito Okello Lutwa, one must trace the path that led to his unlikely rise, the internal contradictions that undermined his rule, and the speed with which he was overthrown by the relentless momentum of Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army, NRA. His presidency, lasting from July 1985 to January 1986, remains a case study in the volatility of African leadership, the fragility of military juntas, and the irony of power seized only to be lost within months. The making of a soldier. Tito Okello's early life was marked by the colonial environment of Uganda, where the British relied heavily on recruiting northern Ugandans, particularly Acholi and Langi, into the military. These communities became the backbone of Uganda's armed forces, while the southern regions were often favored for political and economic development. This colonial legacy ensured that northern soldiers, like Tito Okello, would always find themselves deeply entrenched in the politics of power. Okello joined the King's African Rifles, the colonial regiment that trained African soldiers who later formed the armies of independent East African nations. He rose steadily through the ranks, learning military discipline, strategy, and the politics of survival within barracks. After Uganda attained independence in 1962, Okello became a key officer in the National Army under the leadership of Milton Obote. The military soon became the most decisive political institution in Uganda. When Obote was overthrown by Idi Amin in January 1971, Tito Okello, like many Acholi officers, survived by navigating the treacherous environment of Amin's regime. He was never in Amin's innermost circle, but his cautious survival meant that when Amin was overthrown in April 1979, Okello remained a respected figure in military circles. The return of Obote and the seeds of betrayal. Following the Tanzanian invasion that toppled Idi Amin, Uganda entered a period of chaos. A coalition of political groups, collectively known as the Uganda National Liberation Front, UNLF, struggled to stabilize the country. During this time, Obote maneuvered his way back into power in 1980 through elections widely considered fraudulent. Obote's second reign, commonly referred to as Obote Sect, was characterized by violent repression, especially in central Uganda, where Museveni's NRA insurgency grew. Obote relied heavily on northern soldiers, particularly the Acholi and Langi, to crush rebellion. Tito Okello became one of the highest-ranking generals, serving alongside his ally Bazilio Olara-Okello, no blood relation, but from the same Acholi region. However, tension brewed between Obote and his generals. The Acholi military leadership increasingly felt that Obote and his Langi allies were monopolizing political power. At the same time, the escalating war against Museveni's NRA was draining morale and resources. Obote's failure to end the conflict, combined with suspicions of his favoritism, set the stage for betrayal. The coup of July 1985. On the 27th of July, 1985, the Ugandan military once again became the engine of political change. Led by Bazilio Olara-Okello, troops loyal to the Acholi faction stormed Kampala, ousting Obote from power. Milton Obote fled into exile, marking the second time he had been overthrown. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, there was confusion over who would lead the country. Bazilio Olara-Okello, The field commander of the coup briefly assumed the role of military ruler. However, within 3 days, the more senior and diplomatically inclined Tito Okello Lutwa was chosen as president in an effort to bring stability and legitimacy to the junta. Thus began the short-lived presidency of Tito Okello Lutwa. His tenure was not marked by ambition or ideological clarity, but by a desperate attempt to hold together a crumbling nation and negotiate peace with insurgents. Tito Okello's brief rule. Okello's presidency was fundamentally a caretaker government, born out of military betrayal rather than a coherent political vision. His leadership faced two monumental challenges. One, the National Resistance Army, NRA, led by Yoweri Museveni, which had grown stronger and was steadily advancing toward Kampala. Two, the fractured alliances within the military junta itself, as Acholi officers distrusted their Lanji counterparts and feared reprisals from southern Uganda. Tito Okello, unlike Obote, sought negotiation. In December 1985, his government signed the Nairobi Peace Accord with Museveni's NRA. The agreement, brokered in Kenya by President Daniel Arap Moi, aimed at forming a coalition government and integrating NRA fighters into the national army. But the peace deal was built on mistrust. Museveni signed the accord tactically, buying time to strengthen his forces. The NRA never intended to fully share power with a military junta they saw as illegitimate. Inside Uganda, Tito Okello's presidency faced collapse from the start. The capital was insecure, rebel forces controlled large swaths of territory, and Okello's junta lacked international recognition. His government was paralyzed, more of a military camp than a functioning state. The fall, Museveni's triumph. By January 1986, the Nairobi Peace Accord had collapsed. Museveni's NRA launched a final offensive, marching toward Kampala with discipline and determination. On the 26th of January, 1986, NRA forces entered Kampala. Tito Okello fled into exile, his government disintegrating without much resistance. His presidency, barely 6 months old, ended as abruptly as it had begun. For many Ugandans, Tito Okello's fall was not surprising. He lacked the charisma of Amin, the political cunning of Obote, or the ideological clarity of Museveni. He was a soldier caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Entrusted with power, he could neither consolidate nor defend. After his overthrow, Tito Okello lived in exile, moving between Sudan and later Kenya. Unlike Obote or Amin, he did not attempt a political comeback. His years in exile were quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had marked his presidency. He eventually returned to Uganda under Museveni's rule, where he lived peacefully until his death in July 2006. In death, as in life, he was remembered as a soldier rather than a politician, a man swept along by the tides of history rather than one who shaped them. Legacy Tito Okello Lutwa's presidency is often described as symbolic, a transitional moment between Obote's authoritarianism and Museveni's long rule. His leadership highlights the following historical realities: the dominance of the military in Ugandan politics. Okello's rise and fall showed how fragile civilian institutions were and how easily generals could make and unmake governments. The failure of temporary alliances. The Acholi coup that brought him to power was driven more by frustration with Obote than by any national vision. Without broad-based support, Okello's presidency was doomed from the start. The inevitability of Museveni's rise. Museveni's discipline, strategy, and ideological appeal outmatched the fragmented military juntas, ensuring that his takeover would be decisive. Though Tito Okello is often forgotten, his story is crucial in understanding Uganda's trajectory. His 3 symbolic days of real authority, followed by a fragile 6 months of rule, remind us how fleeting power can be, and how history remembers not just those who ruled longest, but also those who symbolized transition.